Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 95. These are issues that anyone who's doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of the 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 95, the top 3 issues are the syntax of verses 7 through 8, the question of who is speaking in verses 7 through 9, and lastly, the meaning of rest at the very end of the psalm. Is God's rest the land of Canaan, the temple, or a future state? The first issue is about the syntax in verses 7 through 8. So the last line of verse 7 says, "Today, if you hear his voice, hayom im b'kolo tishma'u." And the question is, what does this if clause, this im clause in Hebrew, what does it modify? What is it syntactically dependent on? When we surveyed modern translations and commentaries, we found 3 main options. First, the if clause could modify what follows. And that's how the ESV, for example, takes it. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. A second option is that the if clause modifies what precedes. He is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will obey his voice and not harden your hearts. And the third option is that the if clause stands by itself. It's not dependent on any explicit then clause. We see this option, for example, in the Net translation. Today, if only you would obey him. If only you would listen to his voice. It's expressing a wish and not actually stating a condition. Now, you could make a good argument for each of these 3 interpretations, and on our website, linked in the description below, we lay out the pros and cons of each of them. Here in this video, we'll summarize the arguments for and against the interpretation that we came to prefer. We agree with the ESV and others that the if clause at the end of verse 7 modifies the following clause. If you hear his voice, then do not harden your hearts. The first thing to note in support of this interpretation is that biblical Hebrew if clauses almost always modify what follows, and only rarely what precedes. As the grammar by Juon and Muraoka explains, the order of the components of the conditional clause, the if clause, is almost always condition, conditioned. In other words, it's almost always if, then, and not then, if. A second thing to note is that there are many examples of an if clause followed by a negative directive. If this, then do not do that. One example is Genesis 18:3, where Abraham says, "My Lord, if I have found favor with you, please do not go on past your servant." Psalm 95 would fit this pattern. If you hear his voice, then do not harden your hearts. But there are 2 issues with our preferred interpretation. One is that it doesn't seem to make sense. In Hebrew, the expression hear someone's voice, shama b'kol, means to obey that person. And it wouldn't make sense to say, if you obey him, then do not harden your hearts. That would be a tautology. If you're obeying someone, then obviously you're not hardening your heart towards them. And so why would you tell someone who obeys him not to harden their heart? But the verb hear, or obey, it's a yiktol verb, tishma. It could also mean if you want to obey. And there are a number of examples where yiktol expresses the desire to do something. One example is in Judges 13:16, which the Net translates, if you want to make, im ta'aseh, if you want to make a burnt offering to the Lord, you should offer it. In the same way, Psalm 95 could be saying, if you want to obey him, then do not harden your heart. That would make better sense. It implies that the listener of the psalm has a desire to obey the Lord, and so the psalm encourages or warns this person, if you want to obey him, which you do, then watch out for this. Be careful not to harden your heart like our ancestors did. A second issue with our preferred interpretation is that it conflicts with the Masoretic verse division. The Masoretes did not group this if clause with what follows in verse 8. Instead, they grouped it with what precedes, with the rest of verse 7. But here we note that the Masoretic verse boundaries don't always correspond with sentence boundaries. Take, for example, Psalm 98, which says, verse 8, "Let the rivers clap their hands, let the mountains cry aloud together." End of Masoretic verse. "Before the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth." The phrase "before the Lord" belongs syntactically with verse 8, but it's grouped prosodically according to the accents with verse 9. So in conclusion, we prefer to read verse 7c as an if clause modifying what comes in verse 8. Today, if you want to obey him, do not harden your hearts. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue in Psalm 95 is in the same part of the psalm as the first issue, verses 7 to 8, and this issue has to do with the question of who is speaking. So beginning in verse 7c, the psalm says, "Today, if you want to obey his voice, do not harden your heart, as at Meribah, as on the day of Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors put me to the test. They tested me. They had even seen my work." Notice how the passage begins in verse 7 by referring to the Lord in the third person, if you want to obey his voice. But then the end of the passage in verse 9 refers to the Lord in the first person. They put me to the test. They tested me. It's clear by verse 9 that the Lord is speaking, and he speaks for the rest of the psalm. And so the question is, when does he begin speaking? When does the quotation begin? The NASB has the quotation beginning in verse 9. "Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day of Massah in the wilderness, quote, when your fathers put me to the test. They tested me, though they had seen my work." The Net translation has the quotation beginning in verse 8. And it even supplies a quotative frame, "he says," to make the introduction to the speech explicit. "Today, if only you would obey him," he says, "do not be stubborn, like they were at Meribah." Although we disagree with the Net's interpretation of the syntax of verse 7, as we discussed in the previous issue, we agree with where the Net has placed the quotation marks. And so our CBC translation says, "Today, if you want to obey his voice, do not harden your heart," with the quotation marks beginning with, "do not harden your heart." And so in other words, the psalmist speaks the if clause, and then the Lord himself starts to speak with the then clause. And although the change in speaker is never explicitly introduced, it's hinted at with the phrase "his voice" at the end of verse 7. Right after the phrase "his voice," we begin to hear the Lord's voice. It's very poetic, the way that the psalmist's voice blends into the Lord's voice, and there's probably meant to be some initial ambiguity as to who is speaking. One scholar has noted that the divine voice in the book of Psalms may remain formally unmarked when it begins or ends, often merging imperceptibly and perplexingly with human voices that talk about God. And that's a good description of what's happening in Psalm 95. God's voice merges imperceptibly and perplexingly with the psalmist's voice. If you can preserve the ambiguity and its poetic effect in a translation, then that might be preferable. But if you have to make the beginning of the quotation explicit, like the Net translation does, then verse 8 seems like the best place to do it. We give this interpretation a C rating. The third issue in Psalm 95 is about the meaning of the very last word, my rest, manuchati. In verses 8 through 11, the Lord says, "Do not harden your heart, as at Meribah, as on the day of Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors put me to the test. They tested me, they had even seen my work. For 40 years I was disgusted with a generation, and I would think, they are a people whose heart strays, and they do not recognize my ways. They are a people about whom I swore in my anger, they will not enter into my place of rest." The references to Meribah, the day of Massah in the wilderness, and the 40 years of disgust recall the stories of the Israelites traveling through the wilderness and repeatedly rebelling against the Lord. And in response to their rebellion, the Lord swore that that generation would not enter the promised land. Even Moses was not allowed to enter the land because he didn't obey God's voice at Meribah. In Deuteronomy 32, God says to Moses, "There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. This is because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the desert of Tzin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites." And so in the original context of God's oath, his rest, or his place of rest, referred to the land of Canaan. Because his people hardened their hearts and didn't obey his voice, they were barred from entering his place of rest. They were barred from entering the land. And most interpreters agree on this point, that the rest in verse 11 was originally the land. And that's why we and others have translated it as place of rest. But the question we're trying to answer now is, what would the place of rest have meant for the audience of Psalm 95? Psalm 95 was written long after the rebellion in the wilderness, long after the people had settled the promised land. And yet, for this later audience of Psalm 95, there's an implicit promise that if they obey God's voice, then they will be allowed to enter his rest, his place of rest. What would that have meant for the people who first heard Psalm 95? What is the place of rest that the reader or the listener of Psalm 95 is being encouraged to enter? One option is that Psalm 95 was written during the Babylonian exile. And so the people of Israel are once again in the wilderness, so to speak. And the psalm encourages them to obey God's voice so that they can once again enter the land, enter the place of rest that God promised their ancestors. Another option is that the rest in Psalm 95 is referring to a future state of rest. When the Messiah comes and there's peace in the land and Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled, his resting place shall be glorious. There are good arguments for both of these interpretations, and they're not necessarily at odds with each other. It's the nature of biblical poetry and prophecy to have multiple meanings, multiple fulfillments, and so we don't reject either of these positions. But we do want to propose another position that we think makes especially good sense in the literary context of the psalm, and that is that the place of rest is the temple. This interpretation is explicit, for example, in the Aramaic Targum, which says, "the rest of the house of my sanctuary." Elsewhere in the Psalms, the word rest or resting place is used to describe the temple. For example, Psalm 132 says, "Arise, Lord, and come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. This is my resting place, forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned." And this identification of resting place as the temple makes good sense in the literary context of Psalm 95. Psalm 95 begins with a call to approach God's presence and worship him. "Come, let us shout for joy to the Lord. Let us cry out to the rock of our salvation. Let us approach his presence with praise. In songs we will cry out to him." And then the second half of the psalm begins with a similar call to approach God's presence. "Come, let us bow down and kneel. Let us kneel down before the Lord our Maker." And notice that the same word for come occurs at the end of verse 11. "They will not enter, come into my place of rest." There seems to be an equivalence between entering God's presence to worship and entering his place of rest. The whole psalm seems to be an invitation to worship the Lord in his temple and to do so with joy and reverence. And in this context, it makes sense that the place of rest in verse 11 would refer to the temple. In its original context, the Lord's oath referred to the land. But now in this new context, addressing a new generation of Israelites, the place of rest is the temple. And only those who obey the Lord's voice are permitted to enter and worship. Only those, as another psalm says, who have clean hands and a pure heart. Those who harden their hearts and live in disobedience are denied entrance, just as the wilderness generation was denied entrance into the land. We give this interpretation of rest a B rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The first issue was about the if clause in verse 7. If you want to obey his voice, then do not harden your hearts. This implies that the psalm is addressed to a group of people who want to obey God's voice, and the psalm encourages them or warns them that if they want to obey God's voice, they should beware of hardening their hearts like the ancestors did in the wilderness. And as you read this warning against hardening your hearts, it becomes clear by verse 9 that the Lord himself is the one giving the warning, the one speaking. In other words, it really is his voice that we're listening to. There's no explicit introduction to his speech, and so there's some ambiguity, but that might be the point. We're supposed to listen carefully so as to discern his voice and to obey him. Those who listen to his voice, who obey him, and who approach him as he prescribes with reverence and joy and with obedient hearts will be allowed to enter his resting place, to enter his presence and worship him. But those who harden their hearts and refuse to obey him will be denied entrance into his resting place, just like the wilderness generation who rebelled against him. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 95, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. All our videos are offered free of charge, thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.